As you can see from the title of my presentation here, I initially focused on Croatia and North Macedonia, but I quickly found out that these countries cannot be compared for one simple reason, together with the other Eastern European countries. So I extended and I compared Albania with every country in Eastern Europe. The reason why they cannot be compared is because they've been offered different deals by the EU at different times. So they do not have the same deal with the EU, although now it's more unified. The title now is the EU Politics of Differentiated Enlargement. Differentiated enlargement is something I'm trying to spin from differentiated integration, which I will explain very shortly. And Albania's Catch-22 challenges, which I'll also explain what Catch-22 means and where this will lead us. So this is what to expect from the short presentation. I'll briefly explain differentiated integration and enlargement. I'll talk a bit the truth about what's really going on, because there is a lot of fluff out there in books and articles. I'll highlight Albania's Catch-22, and I'll highlight 3 of them. And finally, I'll provide 4 recommendations how to progress going forward. So when I started at LSE, we had a professor, Spiro Economides, from the Hellenic Observatory, who had this seminal piece in 2008 called The Politics of EU Differentiated Enlargement. So integration usually is referred to integration within the EU, moving at different speeds. When you apply it to enlargement, it means that the EU decides to move at different speeds with non-EU member states, right? So, and this is a decision made by the EU, and it's not made by the aspirant countries. If it was up to Albania and North Macedonia, will join tomorrow, right? But it's actually the member states who decide when the countries will join. And to make the decision, they asked 2 questions. What is the territory we're involved with? So in this case, Albania or North Macedonia, as we discussed. And where do I want our borders of the EU to be, right? It is clear that they wanted the borders to be with Russia, for example. You have the inclusion of the Baltics, you have the inclusion of Bulgaria and Romania. But with the Western Balkans, which now has taken all the negative attributes of the term Balkans, right? It seems that it is keen, but it's also not keen, right? The reason why it has entered into contractual binding agreements with these countries at different times is because of the developments, right? Some countries came out of communism a bit slightly earlier, or it started already trading with the Western Europe. And then you have the wars in Yugoslavia and so on. So you have different things happening, and the EU creating different policies to address those issues. I want to highlight here that what this country and North Macedonia has benefited from is the stabilization, first Stability Pact, and then the Stabilization Association Agreement. I want to highlight, and I'll make this very clear, that these are very different agreements to what was offered to other Eastern European countries, right? Including Bulgaria, Romania, and Slovenia. So it's a very different deal compared to the Europe Agreement, which I'll explain just a little later on. These are agreements that don't necessarily offer the membership. They're only a promise. I mean, now that we've started negotiations and so on, it seems like it all made sense, but that wasn't very clear in 2000. So, yeah. So here I put a map of the history of when these Eastern European countries started to trade favorably with the EU. Some started much earlier, and I must say that Yugoslavia, for example, already in the 80s, had a free trade agreement with the EU. Right, and Croatia then benefited from that, and North Macedonia too. But here I want to highlight that only after the end of the Bosnian War, right, what we call the Balkans now, but before it included Romania and Bulgaria too, right, they were offered a Europe agreement, right? So first they get the free trade agreement, which I've highlighted in the map, and the free trade agreement is the economic deal, right? But you also need a political deal. And the Europe Agreement is the holy grail of integration. The Europe Agreement was what the EU had to let other countries join in, right? Something that the Western Balkan countries did not get, right? It must be a highlight. So in Albania, for example, in 1992, in December 1992, the same time as the Baltic countries. It's funny, initially the EU grouped Albania with the Baltic countries. They didn't know what to do with Albania, right? Who do we group it with? So they grouped it with the Baltics, right? But the Baltics then in 1994, they got a Europe agreement, which said, hey, you're going to join the EU, and the Europe agreement has key phases that you need to fulfill to join, right? It was a very clear process with a la carte kind of options to take and achieve, right? So although this was mentioned in the deal in 1992 that we are working towards a Europe agreement with Albania, that agreement never comes, right? And Professor Bianchini very well highlighted that in 1991, 1993, we do have an economic crisis, right? Because when we get a free trade agreement, right, the whole economy that had been built for 50 years disappears in a day, right? Together with it, all the institutions, right, which leads to instability and so on. But I want to highlight something a bit more than that, because if you see the reports about democracy and development, they're positive. Albania is making strides towards the economy, is making strides towards democracy. Although the leader, then the democratic leader Berisha, had arrested the opposition leader, right? So you have that, in a way, uneasy situation where they want you to join in a way. There is positiveness, although the situation on the ground, clearly you don't meet the conditions, right? But I would argue Bulgaria didn't meet the conditions either, Romania either as well. It is a political process, it is a subjective process, it's not an objective process, and this needs to be made clearer. And that's why I say we need to talk a bit about the truth. And what I found out from my research is that the reason why Albania does not get a Europe agreement, or Europe reneges on its promise to give a Europe agreement to Albania, has to do with the Greek-Albanian relationships, which in the early 90s are really tense, really tense. Like I will give two examples actually. There is 5 Omonia members arrested in Albania, accused of treason, for example. They were caught with weapons and so on. And what happens is that Greece, as a result, expels 70,000 Albanian illegal immigrants in a day, which the EU said it was a bit excessive. And they said, hey, we've welcomed 500,000, right? Then a priest is arrested, and as a result, 20,000 Albanians are removed from Greece and brought back to Albania. So you have a really, really tense situation, right? You have maybe a provocation from Greece, but you also have an overreaction from the Berisha government. And where that leads to is that Greece actually blocks the humanitarian aid that the EU had promised to Albania, which was then seen as quite negative, right? It did harm Greece's reputation, but it happened nevertheless. The situation was only normalized in 1996, where you have the Friendship Treaty signed. That treaty, in theory, had to also address the issue of the illegal immigrants, Albanian immigrants going to Greece. There's no provision of that. There's only mention of the Greek minority in Albania, and the legal Albanian immigrants don't come to Greece. So, like with the previous speaker, who said the treaty between Bulgaria and Macedonia should be seen, North Macedonia should be seen a bit, should be analyzed further. I would argue that the same needs to be with this treaty as well. Now, the Thessaloniki summit is very interesting. Everyone says that this is where the EU promised EU integration for the EU. Actually, what they did promise is to stop the process and block the process and make it way slower. Because this Thessaloniki summit, what it does is it codifies the concept of regionalism, first developed with the Stability Pact, which says that you need to have good relationships with non-EU member states to join the EU, right? But this was not applied to the case of Croatia and Slovenia, right? Slovenia only vetoed Croatia's bid for 1 year, and due to international pressure removed it, and the issue remains unsolved, right? And I would argue, at the same time where they codify the regionalism aspect for the Western Balkans alone, right? Cyprus joins, right? Which is a conflict zone at war with Turkey, right? It's an island divided in two, right? So on the one hand, you want us to solve all our issues now before joining. On the other hand, you accepted Croatia and you accepted Cyprus, with them not solving these issues, and you accepted Bulgaria and Romania without meeting the conditions, right? So we have this, as I mentioned earlier, It's a subjective geopolitical process. It's not the objective one, right? And moreover, the Thessaloniki summit, just to highlight, Albania so far has not been judged by the Copenhagen criteria, right? The Copenhagen criteria are for the accession process, right? The Stabilization Association Agreement is a pre-accession process, right? So with different sets of preconditions. And as Professor Bianchini mentioned now when we are open in negotiations and all that, now we will be judged on the Copenhagen criteria. And the question is, do we fulfill the economic, political criteria? Fine with our key communicators, just laws that you copy-paste, right? But how is the political freedom in Albania? Is it much worse or better, right? How is the economic development, right? So these are the key questions. Now, Catch 22, I take it from literature. It's a novel, very famous novel, and it simply refers to a situation. So my argument is that EU's differentiated enlargement with the Western Balkans has put Albania especially, but also North Macedonia and the whole countries actually, in an impossible catch-22 type, right? So no matter what they do, the result is the same, right? And we take this from a situation of war, right? And I would argue the 90s seem the decade of peace, but the 90s is also the decade of war, and they live together, and we need to reconcile that. So this brings me, and just to highlight, the original title for the novel Catch-22 is Catch-18. So I think you can play with 18, 22, and that will be fine. So Albania has three, what I term catch 1, 2, 3, which are very difficult for it, but I would argue the same is for Macedonia, North Macedonia. So we'll go into detail. The first one is about identity. Albania cannot Europeanize, right, until it has joined the EU, right? But it cannot join the EU until it has Europeanized, right? This is the. But then I add the third layer, right? Or accepts the maximum demands from member states, right, in the negotiation process. In this case, it could be Greece, it could be Bulgaria, and so on. It could be France, it could be anyone, right? Which, in the end, do harm Albania, right? I would argue, because they are the interests of other countries, right? Hence, Albania remains out and non-Western. So this is the first catch, and very important, right? Hence why, this 30 years, we should have had full the Europeanization of the Albanian society, right? Instead, what I notice now, it's a fight between Europeanization and the Arabianization of the society, right? So this is very interesting to see. Sorry?
Don't take that far.
No, not far at all.
I'll go to Turkey, but not.
No, the Arabianization of our identity.
No, that's too much.
Now with the economy, Albania cannot develop its economy until it has full access to a single market. If you can do that?
That's not organization. I don't know.
Albania cannot develop its economy without having full access, not only free trade, I mean a custom union, right? Like full access, the fourth freedom and all that, right? But will not get full access until it has developed its economy, right? Or it annexes all the aspects of the Stabilization Association Agreement, which are contradictory. On the one hand, they give you access to the EU market, so in theory you can sell tomatoes for €5 in Italy, right? On the other hand, they demand you to open to the other Balkan countries, Western Balkan countries, all agricultural producers, right? So, as a result, Albania's, there are benefits to regional cooperations as such, but of course the best benefit is to trade directly with the EU. That's where you get technology transfers, you get more capital and so on, right? So this is also a contradiction. And the third one is being a good neighbor in the Balkans, right? Which is an oxymoron. It's very difficult, right? And Albania cannot join the EU until it is deemed by the member states as a good member, right? But it won't be deemed as a good member until it has joined the EU. Like Bulgaria is seen as a good member, as a good neighbor, because it's a EU member. But what the previous researcher was saying was quite scary. Or accept maximum demands which harm Albania, right? Hence, Albania remains out as it is not considered a good neighbor. Now, as I said, I'll keep it very short. I have only 3 recommendations. You're either in or out, right? This idea that like you're in between and so on has created the catch-22 impossible situation for Albania, North Macedonia, but also Greece and also Serbia and so on, right? The region, the Balkans, is so intertwined in history, in culture and so on, that it must join, I would argue in the paper, together as a group, right? Because if you separate them individually, right, North Macedonia becomes a prey to Bulgaria's interests and so on, right? Whereas if there is a group focus, then the EU Commission and the supranational institutions could place more pressure on the intergovernmental institutions, like the Council of Europe, right, to limit the power of member states in the negotiation process, right? They can still get a great deal, but not achieve all their maximus demands, right? Thank you very much.